The hospital lights had long since dimmed, but the words still echoed. Cold, clinical, final. There's nothing more we can do. That was the moment something in Elise's soul quietly fractured, like porcelain dropped in the dark. And though her face didn't move, her spirit screamed so loudly she thought the ceiling might crack. She'd sat beside that hospital bed for 13 nights straight, fingers entwined with her little sister's, watching machines breathe for her. Hope dying drip by drip alongside the IV line. When the nurse had gently pulled the curtain closed that final morning, Elise didn't cry. She just stood, walked into the hallway, and collapsed against the sterile wall, letting it hold her up because nothing else in the world would. Grief didn't come in sobs. It came in silence, in numbness, in the way she started washing her coffee cup twice without realizing it, or how she stared out her apartment window at 2 a.m. and didn't blink for minutes. "You won't heal from this," someone had said at the funeral. Not unkindly, just bluntly. An aunt who believed in tough truths. Others nodded, murmuring how young her sister had been, how unfair, how fragile life is. But Elise just watched the wind move the churchyard grass and thought about how the world had the audacity to keep turning. She went back to work a week later and never mentioned it. She smiled through Zoom calls, typed emails, folded laundry, answered texts with emojis, and let the world think she was functioning, because performing was easier than explaining. Her friends gave her space, which felt more like abandonment than kindness, and church felt like a foreign country, full of people singing words she didn't believe anymore. She stopped praying the day her sister flatlined. What was the point of speaking to a ceiling? She couldn't enter her sister's bedroom anymore, couldn't hear a violin without shaking, couldn't delete the last voicemail her sister had left, so she just stopped listening to it. Her heart was no longer broken. It was hollow, like something scooped out of her chest and left gaping, unhealed, untouchable. She dated a man for a while who said all the right things, but she didn't flinch when he left. She barely noticed. She ate when she remembered to. Slept when exhaustion pinned her down. And on one particular Thursday night, 4 months and 6 days after the funeral, she sat alone in her living room, knees pulled to her chest, watching the shadows crawl across the floor like ghosts. Outside, the world breathed in soft suburban silence. Inside, she was screaming, but only on the inside. That night, sleep wouldn't come. She laid in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every what if her mind had archived. What if she'd noticed the symptoms sooner? What if she'd prayed harder, louder, longer? What if she had just believed more? Guilt and grief had made a home in her bones, and they weren't paying rent. At 2:43 a.m. she walked into the kitchen and stood barefoot on the cold tile, half hoping the chill would anchor her to the present, because her thoughts were drifting to places she didn't want to go. She reached for the kettle, then stopped. Something on the shelf above her stove caught her eye. A dusty, untouched Bible her sister had given her years ago, wrapped in a faded ribbon, the kind she always tied on gifts. Elise stared at it like it was a grenade. Her fingers hovered. For a moment she felt something old stir. Faint, stubborn, angry. She pulled the Bible down, cradled it in trembling hands, and held it against her chest. Not out of faith, out of desperation. She didn't open it that night, not yet. But something inside her whispered, not in her own voice. Soon. The nights only got longer after that. The kind of nights where time drips like molasses, and every creak in the walls feels like a ghost brushing past your skin. Elise no longer dreamed. When sleep did come, it was just blackness, and when it didn't, she lay awake listening to the soft hum of the fridge and the occasional passing car that reminded her the world still moved outside her grief. She stopped returning calls. Even her best friend eventually gave up and left a voicemail that simply said, "Call me when you're ready to come back to life." But Elise didn't feel like she had a life, just a shadow of one. Every room in her apartment had absorbed her grief like smoke in the curtains. Even breathing inside it sometimes felt suffocating. She'd stand in the mirror brushing her teeth, trying to recognize the face that stared back. Hollow eyes, forced routine, a shell of the sister she used to be. She told herself she was fine. She wasn't. She told herself she was over it. She wasn't. She told herself that maybe God just wasn't real, or worse, that he was and simply didn't care. And in those dark hours of the night, when no one could hear her and the world expected nothing from her, Elise whispered bitter prayers that didn't feel like prayers at all, more like accusations hurled into a black sky. Why did you let this happen? Why her? Why not me? No answer ever came. Just more silence. Cold, familiar, punishing silence. And yet, the Bible sat there on her nightstand, untouched but ever present, like a dare she wasn't ready to take. Some nights she picked it up and just held it, hoping maybe the weight of it would press her pain into something bearable. Other nights, she shoved it under the bed like it accused her. She didn't want verses. She wanted her sister. But the numbness was starting to crack, not with hope, but with something more dangerous. Exhaustion. The grief was heavy, yes, but it was the silence that broke her. The terrifying sense that her cries never went past the ceiling. One night, curled under a blanket on the couch, she caught the faint scent of her sister's perfume on an old hoodie she hadn't washed, and it undid her. Her body shook with sobs she hadn't allowed for months, racking her like waves against a sinking ship. She whispered, over and over, "Please, I can't keep going." Not sure if she was speaking to God or the air or the ache in her chest. And then, at exactly 3:04 a.m., she sat upright. No vision, no angel, just a thought, quiet and insistent, not hers. Psalm 34. She blinked, looked around, nothing but silence. She laughed bitterly, wiping her face. "Now I'm hearing things," she said aloud. But the whisper didn't go away. Psalm 34. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the Bible. It fell open. No bookmark, no memory of where she had left it. And her eyes locked on verse 18 as if guided. "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." The words hit like a soft thunder, gentle and terrifying. Her breath caught. Tears slipped freely now, not from pain, but from the sudden, unbearable sense that someone had heard, that someone had been listening all along. She clutched the Bible to her chest, rocking slightly, not speaking, just breathing. The verse didn't fix her, but it broke something else. Her wall. And for the first time in what felt like eternity, she whispered not a scream, not an accusation, but a prayer. Just one word. Help. The verse haunted her, in a good way, if haunting could be kind. Elise found herself repeating it without meaning to, whispering it while pouring coffee or staring blankly at the microwave counting down her reheated leftovers. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted. The words echoed like a soft refrain, a hymn stuck in her soul, steadying her in ways she didn't understand. For the first time in months, she began to walk instead of pace, breathe instead of sigh, cry without shame. But healing, she soon learned, wasn't linear. It didn't march upward like steps, but spiraled like a storm. Calm one day, unbearable the next. That Friday afternoon, she wandered into her sister's old room for the first time since the funeral. The scent was gone, just dust and quiet. The kind of quiet that feels respectful, almost sacred. Everything was untouched. Violin still on its stand, the bookshelf alphabetized like always. A stack of sticky notes by the mirror filled with her sister's affirmations in looping handwriting. Elise sat on the bed and stared at the corner of the room where they used to sit and talk about nothing for hours. Books, music, late-night shows, before sickness ever touched them. And that's when it happened. A memory she had shoved so far down, it emerged like a wave she couldn't dodge. The night of the diagnosis, her sister hadn't cried. Elise had. Her sister had just taken Elise's hand, smiled through the fear, and whispered, "You're going to be okay." That moment gutted her now, because it was never supposed to be her that needed saving. Her sister had been the light, sunrise in human form, and now Elise felt like she was groping through a cave with no end. Something inside her snapped that night, and the whisper that had once comforted her, Psalm 34:18, suddenly enraged her. She stood in the middle of that room and shouted, "Where were you? You said you're close to the brokenhearted. Where were you when she was gasping for air? Where were you when I begged you not to take her?" Her fists slammed the dresser once, twice, her body shaking. It was the rawest confrontation she'd ever had with God. Not formal, not polite, but real. And then, like a sudden wind through an open window, something broke. Not her this time, but the weight she'd been carrying. She slumped to the floor, breathing hard, empty and spent, like the grief had exhausted itself. And in the stillness, another memory surfaced. Her sister's final words, quiet, weak, but clear. "Tell your story." Elise had never understood them. Now she did. This pain wasn't a prison, it was a passage. Her sister hadn't just died, she had passed the torch. And maybe, just maybe, God didn't cause the pain but had been holding her through every unbearable second of it. Elise opened her journal that night for the first time in almost a year. She wrote the verse at the top of the page in bold, Psalm 34:18. Then she wrote what she had been too afraid to admit. "I'm still angry, but I think I want to believe again." That was her decision. Not a full surrender, not a dramatic altar moment, but the most honest offering she could give. And maybe, just maybe, that's all God had ever wanted. Healing didn't arrive like lightning. It came like dew, soft and unnoticed until the morning light made it shimmer. In the weeks that followed her breaking point, Elise began waking up earlier, not to be productive, but to sit on her apartment balcony with a blanket and a mug of tea, letting the dawn wrap around her like a benediction. For the first time in months, she wasn't afraid to be still. There were no fireworks, no sudden epiphanies, just quiet, sacred mornings where the wind kissed her cheek like a mother's hand and the sun rose like a faithful friend. She started every day the same, whispering the words of Psalm 34:18 like a mantra, not because she fully believed them yet, but because her soul needed to hear them. And slowly, gently, her inner world began to shift. The weight she had carried didn't vanish, but it grew lighter. Her tears still came, but they weren't always bitter now. Sometimes they were holy. One morning she heard a bird singing outside her window and wept, not out of sadness, but because it reminded her that life continued, beauty persisted, and maybe she could too. She began writing again. Letters she never sent, prayers she wasn't sure were prayers, and journal entries that felt like confessions more than reflections. And it was in that written stillness that God met her, not with answers, but with presence. She didn't hear an audible voice, but one morning, after writing "I miss her" for the 10th time, she felt something inside her respond with, "So do I." It stopped her breath. She stared at the page, unsure if she was losing her mind or finally finding her soul. That afternoon she walked into a local church, not for a service, just to sit in the sanctuary. It was empty except for the janitor vacuuming in the back, but the silence was sacred. Elise didn't kneel or cry or sing. She just sat and listened. And in the stillness, she felt the warm pressure of God's nearness like hands resting gently on her shoulders. A week later, she met a woman at a grief support group who had lost her son and carried a grief almost identical to Elise's. The woman looked hollow, but Elise saw herself in her eyes. She shared Psalm 34:18 with her, trembling a little as she spoke. But the woman clutched the verse like it was oxygen. "I needed that," she said with tears in her eyes. That night, Elise realized something profound. Her pain wasn't wasted. It was seed. And it had begun to bloom in someone else. The anger didn't completely vanish, but it no longer ruled her. She began praying again, not for miracles, but for peace. One prayer, in particular, became her rhythm. "Lord, I don't need to understand. Just help me to trust." And each time she whispered it, a little more of her control dissolved. She no longer needed to know why her sister had died, or what plan could justify that kind of loss. She simply began to believe that God was still good, even in mystery. Her friends started to return. Not all, but a few brave ones who had waited for the storm to pass. She hugged them tighter now. She listened more deeply. She no longer needed to be fixed. She just needed to be known. The one emotional thread that remained was her sister's birthday. It was approaching, and Elise wasn't sure what to do with it. Celebration felt wrong. Ignoring it felt worse. So she waited, quietly, asking God what it meant to honor someone who no longer existed on this side of heaven. The answer didn't come. Yet. But her heart was still. For the first time since the hospital, Elise lay in bed one night and whispered, "Thank you for holding me when I didn't know you were there." And as she drifted to sleep, Bible still open beside her, she didn't feel alone. The date arrived quietly, like a guest who lets themselves in without knocking. Her sister's birthday, the first one without her, and yet it felt like she was everywhere that day. Elise woke early, before the sun, her heart heavy but steady. She didn't cry when she opened the curtains, though the sky looked exactly like it had the morning after the funeral. Gray, gentle, unspeakably soft. She brewed a cup of tea, sat on the edge of her bed with the Bible still on her lap, and whispered Psalm 34:18. One more time. Not as a question this time, but as a testimony. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted. She knew that now, deep in her marrow. That verse hadn't just saved her in the darkness. It had become her companion in the light. That morning, Elise did something she'd been afraid of for months. She drove back to her childhood home, now empty since her parents had moved. She hadn't stepped inside since packing boxes after the funeral, but something inside told her she needed to return, not for closure, but to carry her peace into the places where pain had once ruled. The house smelled the same, wood polish and faint lavender, and though the silence greeted her like an old friend, it didn't suffocate her this time. She wandered room to room, memories rising like dust in the sunlight. And then, in the hallway, she found it. An old framed photo of her and her sister from years ago, mid-laughter, arms around each other. It used to make her ache. Now, it made her smile. She took the photo with her, not to hold on to grief, but to carry joy forward. Later that week, Elise spoke at a small church event. Just 10 women seated in a circle, all of them carrying silent stories of loss. When it was her turn, she stood slowly, heart pounding, and said, "I'm not here as someone who has all the answers. I'm just someone who once thought she'd never heal, until God met me at 3 a.m. with one verse that changed everything." She shared Psalm 34:18 and told them about the Bible on her shelf, the scream in the hallway, the whisper in the dark. And one by one, the women leaned forward, eyes wide, not because she had crafted a perfect speech, but because they saw themselves in her unraveling and in her restoration. After the gathering, a woman clutched her hands and said, "I thought I was alone. Thank you for reminding me I'm not." That night, Elise went home and lit a candle by the window. A new tradition she started to honor her sister's birthday. Not to mourn, to remember, to celebrate the girl who taught her to laugh, and the God who taught her to breathe again. She still missed her. That would never change. But now, the ache lived beside peace, and the peace always spoke louder. Elise eventually began writing devotionals, quiet reflections for women like her, shared anonymously at first, until a pastor asked her to speak more often. She didn't say yes immediately, but when she did, it was with full surrender. Not to ministry, but to the God who had never once let go. And sometimes, when the grief tried to creep back in, on holidays, in dreams, in small echoes of the past, she'd go back to that verse, still bookmarked on a page worn thin from touch, and reread it slowly. "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted, and saves those who are crushed in spirit." Not just words anymore, a promise fulfilled, a testimony lived, a scar turned into light. Years later, someone asked her what healed her. Therapy, time, faith. And she smiled gently, eyes soft with memory, and replied, "No single thing. But it began with a whisper I heard at 3 a.m., and one verse I'll never forget."